Welcome to Ask a Therapist, a show where qualified therapists stop by to answer all your questions. Hey you, welcome to another episode of Ask a Therapist. First and foremost, let me just say sorry. Last week you didn't get an episode, but I explained it all in our Monday podcast, which is our flagship podcast, Legally Clueless. So head over there as I make amends. Sour. If you're new to this show, every Friday you get a chance to ask a therapist questions that you've always wanted answered, questions that are going to help you on your healing journey. And in this season, the therapist who's answering all your questions is Daisy. She's a founder and lead counselor at ConvoCare, which is a platform that is making wellness interventions like therapy more accessible, both in cost and also in the type of framework we have when it comes to therapy. And they have a range of therapies, from group therapy, online therapy for those of you in our fam who are not in the country. They also have couple therapy, individual therapy. They have rage sessions, which I found quite interesting, and so much more. So if you check out the show notes, there is the ConvoCare email address and phone number for you to book a session. And now, let's get right into answering all your questions. So we have one of our favorite therapists back, Daisy. And first and foremost, can I just give you your flowers from Zambia? We have Sam from Zambia who wrote in and he said he's constantly waiting for Fridays for Ask a Therapist. So you're impacting beyond Kenya's borders. And it's also great to hear an African man lean into these conversations that we have.
Yes.
Are you ready for the questions in this episode?
Yes, I am. I'm excited.
Yes. So these questions were dropped in our questionnaire form. A link to them is in the show notes. And the first one is, I'm falling out of love after 4 years in a relationship. Does that happen?
Where? Adele, have you been there before?
I think what has happened, what I feel like is in my past, I got into relationships for the wrong reasons. And in one specific one, it was, and my inner child was the one who made the decision to get into the relationship, right? And then during the relationship, I started doing active self-work. So when now the adult is taking over, I'm like, what am I doing here? This doesn't make sense or whatever. So I don't think that's the same as love, because it wasn't, obviously these are people I care for, etc. But I think the beginning was, it was not the relationship I was meant to be in.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that, because it's one of the reasons you could feel that way. It's not strange to feel like you've fallen out of love after 4 years because of a couple of reasons. One could be that you realized that your values do not align anymore. It could also be that you got into the relationship for the wrong reason. So, for example, using another relationship to heal from your past relationship, that could also be a reason to fall out. However, there are stages in a relationship. So when you meet someone, the first phase in a relationship is that you get into the honeymoon phase.
The best phase. And they're perfect.
Yes, pure bliss. So you in the honeymoon phase, you overlook conflict, for example, because you're really into this person, you love them, and so it's the blinding phase, in quotes and quotes. So after the honeymoon phase, you get into what we call the early attachment phase, where now you start seeing the other side of the relationship. So things you ignored during the honeymoon phase that actually need dealing with, which now bring you to the next stage, which is now the conflict phase. Most times when we get into the relationship, we do not think that there could ever be a conflict phase. And so for that reason, it is possible for you not to address conflict as it comes. So at the conflict phase, that is where now it is the make or the break of the relationship. So how you address this phase determines if you keep up with the relationship, continue or not. And then now finally you get into the deep attachment phase, where you have learned how to go through conflict, you've learned how to resolve it, and finally now you get into the deep attachment phase. Point to note, there are levels of intimacy also in a relationship.
Okay.
So there is physical intimacy, where you connect with your partner because of how they look physically, how you bond with them physically. There is emotional intimacy, where you understand one another emotionally. So you love one another and are able to resolve issues emotionally. There is intellectual intimacy, where you bond with your partner because of the levels of understanding that you have in terms of your intellect. So we can speak about topics for a long period of time and have that, feel like you're energized from that conversation. Beyond that, there is experiential intimacy, which I like to term it as the fuel of the relationship. Because now this is what continues to make the relationship something that you'd want to continue, because you get to do things together. You enjoy hanging out together, and so the relationship is able to continue by the fact that you bond with the fact that you do similar things. And then now there is the spiritual intimacy, where both of you connect to a supernatural being together. So all these levels of intimacy need to be there in a relationship, so that the relationship can go beyond the conflict phase.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, like, now the conflict phase, how do we how do you get to the other side?
Yes.
And when do I know I hear we're not? What can you advise this person who sent in this question in regards to in the conflict phase? How do they know that they should walk away from this relationship?
Okay. So a relationship that is abusive is already a sign that maybe you need to walk away from it. And then if your emotional needs are not being, so you bring up issues that need to be resolved, and there is no, effort to resolve it. That can be a call for you to actually think about either leaving or finding a solution around it. Also, there is need to be growth in the relationship. So if you continuously speak about things that need to be addressed and they're not addressed, then this is also a pointer for you to decide whether to stay or to leave. Because if you constantly present something, so for example, people that say, me, I'm just like that.
Take it or leave it.
Take it or leave it. It means that they don't put in effort to actually work on themselves and change. So if there is no growth in the relationships in terms of what you're presenting and what needs to actually be dealt with, then you can make a decision to leave. Yeah.
It's so interesting. The last thing I'll ask on this particular question is in terms of time. A lot of times we look and say, oh, we've been together 7 years or 4 years, and we're looking at the quantity of time, I think, and not the quality. So I feel like the reason this person put in that is maybe they're feeling like they've invested so much. Should they walk away? And after 4 years, shouldn't you be talking marriage or whatever the next step looks like for you? What would you tell them for that specific issue?
Okay. Now, the funny thing is that usually what we term as red flags usually are seen during the early stages of the relationship. And now so for example, continuing to stay with this person in like a marriage, and yet these things have not been addressed, the marriage only makes it bigger. Because now you're continuously with this person. So what I would advise is this person needs to seek support. Support would help you to clarify what are your reasons to stay. Is it that you're afraid of grieving? Is it that your past is coming up? What exactly is making you stay in the relationship that is very hard for you to leave or make a decision around it?
Oh, so interesting.
Yes.
Next question. How do I move on from father wounds while my dad is still alive and still causing hurt? How do I get over the fear of my marriage failing?
Okay. So I'll answer it in two ways. First off, the fear that the past always affects the future is a negative way of thinking that is called generalizing.
Okay.
So it's a limiting belief where you constantly feel, because this happened to me, it has to happen again. So first off, I'd like to reassure this client and let them know, for as long as you're working on yourself and changing yourself and working on making yourself better, building on your self-worth, the past does not always affect the future. So if your parents' marriage failed, does not mean that yours will also fail. But there is a but. For as long as you work on yourself, work on your self-worth, work on that father wound. The feelings of that men, how your perception of men is, how you view men, it also needs to be worked on, so that the past does not always affect the future. It seems like for this specific person, the father wound makes them afraid that their marriage would fail. And for that reason, they need to work on that pain, the emotional pain that comes from their dad. So first off, validating the emotions. So this is how I feel regarding my dad. I would have wanted my dad to be this way, but the fact that he wasn't, this is how I feel about it. As a child, remember, you depend on your parents. And if in any way they fail you, quote unquote, fail you, you build different emotions towards that. So it could be sadness, it could be fear, it could be anger. And it's important that this person deals with those feelings first. Number two, there is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. The person has brought up the fact that their dad is still alive. So it is possible for you to forgive someone without actually reconciling with them. Because forgiveness is you just letting go of the baggage, allowing yourself to be free of the pain that comes of that event. So for them, I would advise them to seek support in getting to a point of forgiveness for their dad, so that they do not have to reconcile with them. Reconciling is rebuilding that relationship. They do not have to rebuild the relationship, but instead they need to forgive. Forgiveness would help them also notice the pattern. So is the father wound affecting them in a specific way? Are they repeating patterns in their relationship? Noticing what these patterns are could also outline for them how their forgiveness is going to be.
That's all for this episode. If you have a question to ask a therapist, please drop it in our question form. A link to it is in the show notes. Catch you next week for the next episode of Ask a Therapist.